want to look at the Phillips curves, the goal here is that we want to derive a relation between unemployment rate and the inflation rate. But the key thing to remember is this relation between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate depends on how wage setters form expectations of inflation, which in turn depends very much on the behavior of inflation itself. So one assumption could be that when wage setters are forming expectations of inflation, they assume that the level of expected inflation equals previous year's inflation rate, i.e. lagged inflation. So pi t is pi t minus 1. The second assumption is that when wage setters form expectations of inflation, they assume that the level of expectation is anchored to some value and never changes. So expected inflation is constant and say is equal to pi bar. So when we're deriving the Phillips curve, we need to, so the relationship between unemployment rate and inflation rate depends upon what assumption we're making with respect to pi t, how wage setters are forming expectations of inflation, which in itself will depend upon the behavior of inflation. So depending upon the assumption being made, we'll have different variations of the Phillips curve. We'll start off with the original Phillips curve. First, we look at the origins of the original Phillips curve. Now, this was first proposed by Phillips, where in 1958, he plotted decades worth of data on inflation and unemployment rate in the UK, as we can see here, for each year from 1861 to 1957. So here, dot represents sample unemployment levels and inflation in a given year. So what Phillips found was a clear evidence of a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment rate, right? Where he noted that lower unemployment rate was associated with higher inflation. Meanwhile, he saw higher unemployment rate was associated with lower inflation. So he found a clear evidence of a negative relation between inflation and unemployment. Now, 2 years later, in 1960, Samuelson and Solo carried out the same exercise for the US. So they replicated the exercise for the US and showed that the relationship held in the US as well, using data from 1900 to 1960, where they saw that a low unemployment rate was typically associated with high inflation rate, and a high unemployment rate was typically associated with lower negative inflation rate. So Samuelson and Solo labeled this relation as the Phillips curve. So this is how the original Phillips curve was discovered. It's an empirical relationship. It was found in the data. So let's try to understand the original Phillips curve. Now, the original Phillips curve assumes what we call, like we said, when we talk about the Phillips curve, it's a relationship between inflation and unemployment rate. And that relationship, like we looked at, depends upon what assumption you make regarding expected inflation. The original Phillips curve is based on this assumption that expected inflation is anchored to some value and never changes. Right, so the original Phillips curve assumes anchored inflation expectations. Our expectations are anchored at some value, like over here we said it's anchored at pi bar. So this is the value around which inflation varies from year to year. So in this case, expected inflation rate is constant and do not respond to actual, inflation expectations don't respond to actual inflation. So agents in the economy simply ignore past inflation and they form expectations of inflation around a fixed number. So we say expectations are anchored around that number. Now, this is a reasonable assumption as long as inflation is stable, as then it's reasonable that you just simply ignore past inflation and assume a constant value of inflation, i.e. the value around which inflation varies from year to year, which was the case till this late 60s, so where we had the original Phillips curve, right? So like we said, so the goal is to derive relation between inflation and unemployment rate. This depends upon how wage setters form expectations of inflation. For original Phillips curve, they just assume inflation is anchored to some value pi bar. And that is because that's a reasonable assumption because inflation is, that's a reasonable assumption when inflation is stable, which was true in the 1960s when the original Phillips curve was discovered. Right, so here the idea is that for the original Phillips curve, they're assuming that inflation is anchored to some value pi bar, which is a reasonable assumption as long as inflation is stable. So let's say inflation varies from year to year around some value pi bar. So in this case, we can say expected inflation is equal to pi bar constant, what we talked about here. This is the assumption we're using for the original Phillips curve. Then we get the curve that Phillips estimated, where we know this is pi t, and instead of pi t, we have pi bar here because that's the assumption we're making for expected inflation for the original Phillips curve. Then we have plus mpz minus alpha ut. Now here pi bar plus mpz is just a constant, and we can clearly see the original Phillips curve shows a trade-off between the inflation rate pi t and the unemployment rate ut, right? So it's just pi t, a constant minus alpha ut. right? So which means that an increase in unemployment rate leads to low inflation rate, a decrease in unemployment rate leads to higher inflation rate, which is what Phillips discovered for the UK, right? Low unemployment rate, higher inflation, higher unemployment rate associated with lower inflation, and what Samuelson and Solo discovered for the US, right? So here it's very important to keep in mind the trade-off is between the inflation rate parity and the unemployment rate unit. So when I say the decrease in unemployment rate leads to higher inflation rate, so just keep in mind there's higher level of inflation rather than increasing inflation. So what we mean by higher inflation rate is, like, say when you lower the unemployment rate, inflation may go up from 2% to 6%, right? So you have a higher inflation rate, but it's not an increasing one. So it won't be the case it's 6% this year, 9% next year, 12% the year after that. So inflation won't keep going up. You have higher inflation, not increasing inflation in the original Phillips curve, right? So like the inflation rate will stay the same at the new rate for each year. So in short, according to the original Phillips curve, if you lower the unemployment rate, you have higher inflation rate, which stays the same for each year. You don't have increasing inflation rate. So if unemployment rate goes down, inflation rate may go up from 2% to 6%, but it won't keep going up. So the trade-off is between inflation rate parity and unemployment rate unity, which is precisely the negative relationship that Phillips found for the UK and Solo and Samuelson found for the US. Let's look at the economic intuition for this trade-off, that why does lower unemployment rate means higher inflation rate and why does increase in unemployment rate means lower inflation rate. The economic intuition comes from our WSPS model because our Phillips curve has in its background the WSPS curve. An increase in unemployment rate, now let's see why does it mean a low inflation rate? Because when unemployment rate goes up, so we know the workers' bargaining power goes down, right? Because now there are a lot of because when unemployment rate goes up, it's difficult for workers to find a job, but it's easier for firms to hire replacement workers. So when workers' bargaining power goes down, they demand lower nominal wages. We know in WSW is equal to PFUZ. So when U goes up, W goes down from WS. And as a result of this, we know from PS prices go down because P is equal to 1 plus MW. And now for given prices in the previous period, a lower price level today means a lower current rate of inflation. So this is the economic intuition for the trade-off, that why an increase in unemployment rate means lower inflation. Because when unemployment rate goes up, we know from WS equation, W is equal to PFUZ, W goes down. And then from PS, we know that P is equal to 1 plus MW. So when W goes down, P goes down. And for given price level in the previous period, a lower, for given price level in the previous period, a lower price level today implies a lower current rate of inflation, right? So the economic intuition comes from a WSPS model. So now here, like this, something to note that the original Phillips curve seems to suggest policymakers could simply keep U low forever by accepting a high inflation rate. Because like we talked about over here, okay, you decrease the unemployment rate at the expense of higher inflation rate, not increasing inflation rate, right? So it seems to suggest we could simply keep U low forever by accepting a higher inflation rate. But then the question arises that will expected inflation remain constant? Will inflation expectations remain anchored if inflation is always too high, right? If you're maintaining a low unemployment rate in exchange for a higher inflation rate, will your expectations remain anchored if you see that the inflation rate is always higher than what you expected? So will your expectations will they still stay anchored? So the answer to this is that if inflation continues to exceed the anchored rate, okay, when you low unemployment rate, you end up getting a higher inflation rate. And if so if inflation continues to exceed the anchored rate, wage setters will change the way they form inflation expectations. So expectations will become de-anchored, which will bring us to why the original Phillips curve disappeared. More on that later.